The end.
Thank you.
That was quick. Okay, good morning. I'm John Carr, as you just heard, and I'm the Secretary of the Children's Charities Coalition on Internet Safety in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to focus specifically in my talk this morning on child abuse images, child pornography, child sex abuse images. People call these things by different names in different countries, but clearly what we're are talking about are images which depict children being sexually abused, and the way in which the internet has completely and absolutely changed the nature of the market, in inverted commas, for child sex abuse images. We had a very distinguished person in the United Kingdom called Sir William Utting, who did an inquiry which was published in 1997. It was called People Like Us, and it was looking into some very bad cases of child abuse that had taken place in orphanages in the United Kingdom, and it was clear that it had been organised by a ring of paedophiles who were recruiting each other to work in different orphanages just so that they could get access to children. And part of what they were also doing was exchanging child pornographic images between each other. And Sir William Utting looked at the state of the market, as I say, in inverted commas, for child pornographic images then, 1996, 1997. And what he said was, before the internet came along, the availability of child pornographic images was similar to that which you would get in a cottage industry. In other words, before the internet came along, according to this distinguished scholar, an expert on child abuse images, he said that if you wanted to get hold of child pornographic images, it was quite difficult, actually, to do it. You had to know somebody who already possessed them. You had to be part of, for example, a ring of paedophiles who were interested in child pornography. And if you weren't part of that group, in reality, it was quite hard for you to find the images and get hold of them. What he said, however, what he also went on to say, however, was the way in which the internet had completely changed that, and changed it from being this rather difficult, this rather small industry, cottage industry as he put it, into what somebody else later called a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And we also had, around the same time, 1995 in fact, to be precise, the police force in Greater Manchester. Manchester is a big city in the north of England. They've got a rather second-rate football team that some of you may have heard of. I'm from Leeds, by the way, so I ought to just make that clear, declare an interest. The Manchester police in 1995 counted the total number of child pornographic images which they confiscated in that year. Now, 1995 was probably the last year of the old world, at least in Britain. In other words, from about 1996 onwards, we began to see a huge increase, a huge explosion, really, in the take-up of the internet in the UK. So 1995 was an interesting year for the Greater Manchester Police to count the total number of images child pornographic images which they confiscated, and the total number in that year was 12. That's a dozen. And all of the images which they seized were on bits of paper. 4 years later, the same police force, covering exactly the same area, same population, arrested one man who in his possession had 1.5 million child pornographic images. Now that, let's be clear, a lot of those images were repeat images. They weren't all unique and different images, but nonetheless that gives you some idea of the way in which the advent of the internet has completely changed the volume of child pornographic images in circulation. And let's also not forget that behind the images lie children who are being sexually abused, with the dire consequences for them that we all know about from other research. So, you heard in the introduction that I work with this group of children's charities in the UK called CHIS. These are the logos of all of those charities. Some of these charities are extremely well known, household names in reality in the United Kingdom. And what we have found, certainly in the UK, is that when all of the big children's organisations come together and speak with one voice, as we've managed to do around the issues of child protection, the media have to listen, and that means the government have to listen. And when we work alongside parliamentarians like Alan Michael, who's been a great activist and a great friend to the child protection cause in Parliament, it certainly, in my opinion, adds greatly to our impact and our effectiveness. And we're working, as Dieter mentioned earlier, now in a European alliance with all of these different countries at the moment in membership, where we're trying to, as it were, replicate the same kind of thing as we've already been doing in the UK. I'm going to focus specifically on some of the international dimensions of dealing with child pornography, child sex abuse images, because obviously we're here at a global conference. And a lot of the data that you're going to hear from me now, I have to acknowledge, is the product of a wonderful piece of research by the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States of America. They did a big global survey of the state of laws and in this field, which they published, I think it was about 2 years ago now. And what they found then was that there was still over 80 countries, in fact I think it was nearly 90 countries in the world, where there was still no specific law, no specific reference to the existence of child pornography at all, whether online or offline. Now, admittedly, some of those countries would use their general obscenity laws to arrest people who are peddling child pornography and confiscate it from them. But it's certainly our view, it's certainly my view, that if you don't have a specific law that refers in very clear terms to child pornography as being an offence and giving the police specific powers to act in relation to it, then it can tend to slip down the agenda. And because if you haven't got a specific law, equally you don't have a specific focus on it. Very often there will be no crime statistics, for example, which can be published to monitor the effectiveness of police action in this field. And so we regard having a law which specifically refers to child pornography as being an important building block in any legally based strategy for dealing with this issue. There are still over 20 countries in the world where it is technically impossible to commit any kind of crime online because there is no mention in their national laws of cyberspace as having any kind of legal existence. So, for example, in the UK, we've got the Computer Misuse Act, we've got a number of different pieces of law which make it clear that it's just as possible to commit an offence in cyberspace or in relation to a computer as it is in the real world. And this has obviously very, very definite consequences, because clearly these are not countries that don't have access to the internet. They do have access to the internet. And organised criminal groups who are very heavily involved in the production of child pornography are aware of these legal loopholes and can shift material there without having to worry about the legal consequences. I'll give you an example of some of the things that can happen if you don't have a law in relation to which defines cyberspace. There were in one country 2 young men, well, there were hundreds of thousands, millions of young men playing this online game in which you could either buy weapons, you know, with a credit card to use in the game, or you could get these weapons by being very good at the game and building up points that won you a weapon. And if you got this new super strong laser gun, you could then obviously kill more people or kill more of your enemies in the game online, and in the end you could end up as the champion and so on. Well, anyway, what happened in this particular case was one of these young men hacked into the online account of the other young man and stole his weapon and took it back to his own account. So he then had this master weapon that could enable him to be the champion of the world in this particular game. The other guy found out who it was who had stolen his weapon. And he got on a train and a bus, and he went, because the guy lived in the same country as him, he went round to his house and he killed him, he murdered him, stabbed him to death with a knife. Now when the guy was caught, the police were able to charge him with the murder. Obviously there was a body there on the floor in the real world, so there was no question about the murder. but they weren't able to charge him with theft, the theft of the weapon or the other damage done on the online system, because there was nothing in their legal framework that would have allowed them to make a charge. Now, I acknowledge that charging somebody with theft when there's a murder charge on the table as well is perhaps not so important, but it makes the point that without a specific legal framework to act within, then clearly in dealing with internet child pornography, the police are going to be at a severe disadvantage. One of the key tools, one of the key instruments which has emerged in the fight against child pornography on the internet are hotlines. Essentially, these are civil society constructions. In Britain, ours is called the Internet Watch Foundation. I was a director of it for the first 7 years of its life. And this enables members of the public, anybody at all, to report any abusive images which they find on the internet. The hotline then investigates to see if it is illegal or not, and if it is, it reports it to the police, and in the case of the UK, it would report it to the internet service provider whose server it was on, and then providing the internet service provider remove that image expeditiously. That's generally understood to mean within 24 hours, although by and large it's usually within an hour. Then no criminal liability arises in relation to the internet service provider. Well, there are still only 31 of these hotlines covering the whole of the world. There isn't a hotline at all in the Arabic language, for example. So it is a gap. It's a gap that needs to be filled. Every country, or certainly every region, certainly every major linguistic group ought to have at least one hotline to which they could report these images if they're found by any of their citizens. There are still only round about 30 police forces in the world that have the technical knowledge and the expertise to take part in international police actions on cybercrime. This also is extremely important, and the criminals and the people who work with child pornography are perfectly well aware of those countries where the police have had no training or have got very little equipment to enable them to participate in any kind of international police action. So that's another issue that needs to be addressed if we're going to have have a consistent strategy for dealing with this. There is, the police have understood very well the global nature of the way child pornography on the internet is working, and they've created a new body called the Virtual Global Task Force. But it still only has 5 countries in membership of it. Those are the UK, the USA, Canada, Australia, and Italy. Interpol is obviously Interpol is also part of it. The Germans, the Japanese, and the Swedish police are lining up to become members, but it's been in existence now for nearly 4 years, and it still only has 5 national police forces in it. We definitely need to strengthen that, because that institution, and get more national police forces to join, because that's a very practical way in which the police can coordinate their action and work together, fighting not just against child pornography, I might say, in this case, but also against online sexual predators who are looking for children in chat rooms and on social networking sites and so on. Alan mentioned earlier about the way in which different countries are now beginning to block access to known child pornographic websites. I'll explain how this works in the UK, because it's essentially the same in the other countries. Mexico, Canada, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Italy. There are a number of countries who are now doing the same sort of thing. Basically what happens is this. The hotlines that I referred to earlier, in the case of Britain it's the Internet Watch Foundation, they maintain a list of all of the child pornography websites any that they know about anywhere in the world. They maintain a list of those sites. That list is given over to internet service providers in the UK, and they use that list to block any access to those sites. So if somebody in the United Kingdom types in an address of one of those websites, they will not be able to get access to it. They will either get a message telling them that they're trying to access an illegal child pornography website, and if they persist in doing this, they will be committing a criminal offence, Or some companies, what they do, rather than confirm the existence of the website, they will simply send you an error 404 message. So it will be as if you've mistyped the address or the address doesn't exist. This is one of the measures which has made a big difference to the availability of child pornography in the UK. I think Alan mentioned earlier that when we first started keeping records of this back in 1996, it was just over 18% of all of the child pornography that was being found and reported in the United Kingdom was being published from within the United Kingdom. That's to say, it was being housed on servers that were physically located within the geographical boundary of the United Kingdom. Today, it's less than 0.2%. And we think that's quite a good achievement. It doesn't mean, by the way, just to be clear, that if we had somebody in Britain who was very determined to get access to those child pornography websites, they could still do that. But they'd have to log on to a server overseas. That requires some technical knowledge and some determination, and then log into the child pornography sites from that overseas server. And I'm sure that there are some guys in Britain who are doing that. But for the overwhelming majority of the British public, effectively, all of those known child pornography websites are no longer inaccessible. Now, this is very important as far as we're concerned, because most of the people who are involved in producing these commercial websites of child pornographic images, they're doing it for the money. Then they're not necessarily paedophiles themselves, they're gangsters, they're criminals, and they're making the images to sell them because they want the money. If you can stop them reaching their potential customers, they will stop making the images, and that means fewer children will be abused, and from a child protection perspective, of course, that's a very desirable end result. It doesn't solve the problem completely, we would never say that for 1 minute, but we think it definitely makes an important contribution to dealing with the problem, and we would like to urge other countries to consider doing something similar. Moving on, there are still significant variations between countries, both in the substantive law and in the field of sentencing. For example, one country might define child pornography in a very strict way, a very narrow way. Other countries might have a broader definition of child pornography. And where you've got that difference in law, it can make it difficult for police forces to cooperate. One of the consequences of this is very practical and very obvious to state. What you find in reality is that the police, when they work together on child pornography cases internationally, tend to focus on images of prepubescent children. That's to say, children up to the age of 9, 10, or that kind of age and younger. They tend to avoid, I'm not saying this is not a criticism, let us be completely clear, I am not making a criticism of the police. When you've got an infinite amount of work to do, you're obviously going to select the bits that are easier to do. So if you pick your cases in relation to images of prepubescent children, you're not going to get into any difficult arguments in a courtroom about whether or not the child could have been old enough to have consensual sex with the person, because clearly with a prepubescent child, that question is never going to arise. But it isn't satisfactory because young teenagers have got as much of a right to protection as very young children. But the practical consequences of differences in the substantive law are that the police, in practical terms, will focus on the cases which are frankly easier to get through the courts. Similarly in the field of sentencing. If you are caught in the United States of America in possession of any number of child pornographic images, there is a very, very strong likelihood that you will go to jail. Certainly if you're charged at federal level, you will almost certainly end up in jail, and you'll be in jail for at least 5 years. And in the United States, 5 years means 5 years. In the United Kingdom, if you get caught with child pornographic images in your possession on a first offence, unless there are a very large number of extreme images, there's almost no chance that you will go to jail. In some countries, it's still a felony, it's still a serious crime in the United Kingdom, but in some countries the possession of child pornography is regarded as a misdemeanor, and you will get, slap on the wrist and told to go away and not do it again. So there are important differences in sentencing, and this is important as well, because if you are a criminal and you behave rationally, then obviously you're going to pick a country to house your images or to conduct your business where the law regards these types of offences as being less severe than other ones. I mean, we have to work on the assumption that criminals behave rationally at some point or another. I know they don't always, but that is something. There are also important procedural differences in the way police forces approach cases and gather evidence, which again can make it more and more difficult to work at an international level when trying to deal with internet crime. Bear in mind, here we're talking about child pornography, only child pornography. Now, there may not be another issue on the planet where everybody is in agreement on that child pornography is a bad thing and that it shouldn't be there and that we should do everything we can to get rid of it. And yet, I am still able to recite to you here in this talk this morning lots of ways in which international cooperation for practical purposes does not exist. And if we can't get it right in relation to child pornography, it seems to me we have quite a challenge getting it right in a number of other areas. Still, the majority of images, child sex abuse images that are available on the internet are being published out of the USA. And again, let me remind you what that means is that the images are housed on servers which are physically located within the jurisdictional, the geographical boundaries of the United States. We know this because since 1996, the UK's Internet Watch Foundation has been tracing every image that's reported to it, and as I've said, in every year since then, the majority of images have come out of the USA. Now, I want to make it clear, by the way, that one of the reasons for this is that the USA has the largest physical capacity for hosting images on the internet or providing internet services, and the USA does a huge amount of work in combating child sex abuse images and child sexual predators on the internet, and US law enforcement are, they put millions and millions of dollars and millions of man hours into dealing with this. But that fact remains nonetheless, and it's partly a product of their laws, partly a product of the fact that the physical infrastructure exists. I'm nearly at the end of my remarks now. The banks and the credit card companies have been coming together and working together very well through something called the Financial Coalition, which has existed now in the USA for several years, and we're now trying to recreate or create a similar version of it in Europe for the European banks and the European-based credit card companies. And what they've, because I'm talking principally here, by the way, unless I made it clear earlier, about the commercial the sale of child pornography over the internet, commercial sale of these images, which was initially, at any rate, facilitated almost entirely through the use of credit cards, Visa and MasterCard. Well, obviously, Visa and MasterCard didn't want this. It was very bad for their corporate image. It was specifically against their terms and conditions of service, but they didn't, at the time, have a very effective mechanism for policing it. The financial institutions led by Visa and MasterCard, again, have put millions and millions of dollars and man-hours into stamping this out. And they're doing this through the vehicle of the Financial Coalition that I mentioned earlier. But the criminals involved in this are very clever. They move around a lot. They move very fast, and they are still finding ways to get paid. So it's really important that the Financial Coalition carries on with this work, because, as I said earlier, if we can stop these guys getting the money, then the trade, a large part of the trade, will essentially dry up and vanish, and that means fewer children will be abused. Now, you might have thought I was then saying, well done, the financial institutions, and by and large, that is what I intended to say. However, they have recently made what I consider to be a huge blunder. In the UK and a number of other countries, including the USA and so on. You may have seen them, these credit cards with well, they're not credit cards strictly speaking, but they've got the Visa and MasterCard logo on them. And in the UK and in the USA, you can buy them for cash. You can walk into a shop, hand over £50, 80, 90 US dollars, used to be more. You hand over £50 and get a card that utilises the Visa or MasterCard payment system on the internet and essentially be able to buy things anonymously. I have bought one of these cards. I registered myself as Mickey Mouse. I gave my address as Buckingham Palace. And I was able nonetheless to get through the system and then use the card over the internet. And that's a really kind of counterproductive measure, because what it means is that people could go on the line, go on the internet and buy things anonymously. And it sets back, I think, a lot of the good work that the financial institutions were doing. I don't know how many of you in the room remember Operation OR. It was called Operation Landslide in the USA when it first started, against a company called Landslide that was in Texas. And they seized the servers from this company and found on those servers the names of 250,000 men who had bought child pornographic images using their credit cards. And 7,200 of these men were in the United Kingdom. And so the American police gave this list of people to the British police, who were then able to go and arrest several thousand of them. Not all of them were arrested for a variety of reasons, but 4 or 5, I think it was 4,500, nearly 5,000 of them. The police came to their door, seized their computers, and over 3,000 of them were convicted. Well, Operation OR would never have been able to happen if these anonymous credit cards had been in existence, because the guys presumably would never have used their own credit card. They would simply have gone round to the local petrol station or grocery shop, bought one of these credit cards anonymously, used it online, and got exactly the same material. So it seems to me that the emergence of these prepaid credit cards is definitely undermining some of the excellent work that the banks and financial institutions have been doing to combat the trade in child pornographic images. So, in conclusion, what I would just say, a lot has been achieved in the field of combating child pornography internationally over the internet, but there's much has been done, but there's much still to be done. And in this, I think parliamentarians do have a key role to play, because we need pressure on governments, we need pressure on national institutions to get the kind of international cooperation that's necessary to see an end to this trade. And parliaments around the world, they all have different powers and different structures and so on, but by and large, parliaments and parliamentarians, therefore, are a key bit of the civil society in a way that helps to achieve progressive changes in the law. And in that, of course, there is a particularly important role that the ITU can play in reaching out to parliamentarians, supporting them, briefing them, and helping them with that task. Thank you.